My name is Nick. I'm with a HIV and Substance Use Training Program. So we're funded by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, and we do sort of harm reduction training, capacity building throughout Ontario, and support a network of frontline harm reduction workers. We were starting to get a lot of requests for information about crystal meth. There's obviously been a lot of attention to opioids in the last little while, but we were hearing that people were hungry for information on crystal meth too. And earlier this summer, we ran these webinars as a dry run and got good response. So we're just running them again to let more people participate and to try and do better quality recordings. But we'll see how that turns out this time around. So, okay. Just before we get going, for folks that aren't familiar with the platform that we're using, you can see who is participating in the call in the right-hand corner there, the top right. And then on the left there, I can see some of you are chatting away, so you can feel free to type in questions as we go. We may address some questions as we go, but we might collect some other questions and come back at the end to get to them at the end. You can also get our attention at the top right there. At the top of the screen there, you'll see a little person icon with a hand up. You can click on that and raise your hand. That'll let us know that you're trying to get a hold of us, and you can, and then we can maybe even have you on the line if it's easier to talk on the phone than chat. You can also private message us, so just find our name in the participants or in the attendees box there, and you can send us a private message too. And if you haven't done already, in the bottom right corner there, you can see all the different resources that we're going to reference, and those are all available to download. So those are typically PDF documents. We'll reference them as we go, but there's lots of good information there, so I encourage you to just start downloading those right from the webinar. Okay. And one last note. You are the first folks to find out and see the new branding for our program. So the Ontario HIV and Substance Use Training Program has been around for a long time. For various reasons that we won't get into now, we're rebranding, refocusing the nature of our work, and we will now be known as the Ontario Harm Reduction Network. And part of re-recording these webinars was to have them branded in line with our new look. And in all the work we do, we try to endeavor to involve people with lived experience of drug use. We are very fortunate that we have Colin, who's been a participant for, how long have you been part of our program now? For a while? 4 years? Yeah, I think it's been the 4th year. Okay. It's been quite a good experience. Yeah. And do you want to just quickly, background? Sure. So my name is Colin. I have been using substances for a very long time. I started out with the gay community. I'm now switched to meth for the most part, which we will be talking about as I go on. I'm also HIV positive for 35 years, which actually brings its own issues to using substances. Something, again, I think we'll touch on. And apart from that, I work with Black Cap and a number of other organizations in the community. Yeah, okay, great. I'm going to lead us through some of the slides here, and Colin's going to jump in as we go. We're going to sort of tag team a bit as we go through this. So here's our new logo and sort of colors that we're using. So we will start our recording now. Okay, so thanks and welcome to this webinar about methamphetamine. We've divided this webinar into 2 parts. Today is really focusing on the basics, and then we will next week we will be getting into more in-depth information. So today we're going to be looking at sort of just basically what is methamphetamine, the sort of effects of it, how it's used. We're going to look at the equipment. Part of the timing on all of this is that harm reduction programs around Ontario just this past summer started distributing crystal meth pipes. Which you can see I'm holding one up here. We'll look at these in more detail later. So this was to tie in with that as well. and we'll touch on some basic risk and harm reduction strategies. If we have time, we'll also look at a bit of the history. And then next week, we will be going much more deeply into how to actually engage with people if they're coming into your agencies and talking about methamphetamine. Maybe they're coming in intoxicated, signs to look for in terms of overdose or how to respond to that. How you can engage with people, some very practical tips in terms of how to engage with folks. And we'll look at some of the supports that we can provide to people. So we'll also have someone else that will present a different perspective. So Colin, you haven't necessarily struggled much when it comes to crystal meth.
No.
Right.
I think I've been using harm reduction techniques in this sort of before. They were really sort of called harm reduction techniques. Some of this I'll be talking about. For me, substances, my use of substance has been either for a specific purpose, either for dancing, going out to the bars, but always in a positive light. So no, I have not struggled. I have not really needed to get assistance.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think when it comes to methamphetamine, we often think of it as a very dangerous drug, and I'm not trying to minimize the serious impacts that it can have on people, but we wanted to show the spectrum of experiences that people have when it comes to meth use. So next week we will have Brian, who has had really struggled when it came to meth. He is now working at a drop-in in Toronto. So he's going to talk more about his experiences next week. As I said, please just type in questions and comments in the chat box. We do have my colleagues Frankie, Saf, and Kim Trenchard are working in the background here, keeping an eye on that too, so they can respond to stuff. So please participate as we go. And this is just a quick outline of where we're going for the next hour or so, hour and a half or so. Okay. So we also wanted to get a sense of who is on the call. So we are going to pull up a question if I can find it. Here we go. If you can just click the buttons there, help us get a sense of where you're at. Looks like we have about 74 people on the call, so that's we've got a significant number of people, and it looks at least through registration that folks from all over the province are joining us.
I thought people from all over the province.
So just as you click there, the work we do, we're funded by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, so obviously our focus is around Ontario, and there isn't a part of the province, I don't think these days, that hasn't been touched around with crystal meth use. It varies from region to region, though. We'll touch on that later. And we did get interest from outside of Ontario around these webinars as well. Okay, let's just see where everyone's in. So we've got a real diversity of folks from all over the province. Hamilton, Niagara, looks like we got the most folks from down that way. Okay. All right, thank you. Fine, thanks. And then we have another poll here. So we have sprinkled some polls in throughout, but this is also, we've created some broad categories for this one. If you could just let us know where, so if you could just sort of indicate, you have to pick one of these, what perspective are you bringing to your work or to this webinar today? Okay. You take that. Okay. Many harm reduction workers. Okay. Increasingly, we're seeing this role that public health is playing in terms of harm reduction. Some hospitals, addiction withdrawal management. Yeah. Mental health. Okay. We know the intersections between mental health, and that's particularly interesting when it comes to meth. And for people who've been using meth for a long time, they can often develop psychosis or have paranoia, and is it drugs or is it mental health? It's hard to tell sometimes. We'll touch a bit on that, probably more so next week. So, okay, I'm going to close that one. Okay. Here's a question. This is just to check some knowledge here. So, is it cognitive function? I have that.
Yeah.
Where is this? Did you just move that? Or did I? Sorry. Sorry, folks. We're just figuring out a system here. I think I'm in touch with it. So the question was around meth irreversibly impairs cognitive functioning. Yes, no, or you're not sure. Okay, so we're split 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 on this one. All right, so let's see what Colin and I would have to say about this. Are you
Okay.
Oh, sorry, we're just pulling our slides back up. I hear a lot of time around, oh, meth is one of these very dangerous drugs. It does all sorts of damage. One of the things you often hear is around how much it damages the brain. That, I think, has been over-exaggerated. And I'm going to, if I can get my slides back here, we'll talk about a guy named Carl Hart. If you don't know this name, here, I'm going to move. Can you just not go to the different settings? I'm just, yeah, okay. So Carl Hart, if you haven't heard of this guy or read his stuff or watched his videos, I really encourage you to. He's a neuroscientist down in the States. He's done some really interesting work looking at, drugs, and he's had a particularly interesting crystal meth. And he has a YouTube video called Tempering Hysteria with Data. You can click right there. That'll take you straight to the video on YouTube. And if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of his work, there's a reference to his research paper that he wrote around this. And he would argue that a lot of our research is over exaggerated some of these risks. That's not to say that, again, it can't do serious damage. Any drug use can. Any drug use can create serious physical and mental health issues for folks. But what we are also now understanding is that the brain is very plastic and can rewire itself and can recover. It can take a long time, and we'll talk a bit more about that, the length of time for recovery with methamphetamine use later and next week. But we just wanted to throw a caution out there that sometimes some of the dangers have been over-exaggerated.
And I think a lot of that just has to do with just the press and just the attitudes of society in general. I mean, one of the lines that I saw where he said, it's complicated, and I think that's exactly how you have to do it.
And it's so individualized, too.
Yeah. So some people definitely, other people, no. And I guess it also depends. Why are you using the drug?
Yeah.
And that's something that we come back to. Okay.
When we think of crystal meth, we have a certain image of who uses it and why they use to get it, how they're using it. But again, there's a spectrum in terms of how people choose to use, from just occasionally swallowing a little bit right up into injecting large amounts. And so again, there's going to be a spectrum of how people present and the problems they run into. I don't know how many of you are aware that crystal meth is very structurally, at a chemical level, is very similar to drugs like Adderall and Ritalin. And who are we prescribing those to? Just type in the box there if you know what do we use Ritalin and Adderall for, right? No one's typing. Oh, there's someone. But I think it's fascinating to me when we look at the types of behaviors that people exhibit when they're under the influence of methamphetamine, or sometimes the underlying issues that people who are attracted to meth use. Very often we see this connection with ADD, ADHD. And then those drugs are very structurally similar. And in some ways, what we're doing right now is putting a lot of high school kids basically on strong amphetamine type drugs. But they're also swallowing pills. They're not smoking it or injecting it. So that's an interesting observation. So let's get into talking a bit more about the meth 101. What actually is methamphetamine? So it's a potent amphetamine. So amphetamines, they're just a class of stimulant drugs. There are other classes such as cathinones, different drugs like caffeine or cocaine. Those are also stimulants, but there's a whole family that belong to amphetamines, and there's been various versions over the years. So amphetamine was first synthesized in the late 1800s. During World War II, we saw troops on all sides being given types of amphetamines. In the 50s and 60s, it was quite popular, marketed particularly to housewives. I started going to raves in the late 90s and dance clubs. Did you ever find?
That's where I first got introduced.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, it was a dance club.
Yeah.
That's why I did it.
Yeah.
You know. The attitudes have changed somewhat about it now, and you talk about that, I guess, as you progress. But yeah, it was a party drug, basically. Yeah.
It was interesting to me, I knew it as jib, which was a methamphetamine powder, or you had crystals, which was known as ice, and you'd smoke it. But people were using it to stay up all night till 8 o'clock in the morning dancing. Yeah. Then I started doing work more within the gay community, and started seeing gay men using it, but it was a different context, a different setting, and it became a very sexualized drug for them. So that's another thing to keep in mind is who is using it, what's the context for use. And we're seeing increasingly people using ADHD drugs and using those, snorting those. These are all related drugs. These are some other names for methamphetamine. I've heard of crystal. Tina is very common within the gay community. T. Yeah. Those are some other names
Molly.
There.
Molly.
Molly's not methamphetamine. MDMA. Slightly different drug. I'm curious if people can type in is there any local lingo? So what's that one? British is the local lingo. Okay.
Oh.
Tina. Okay.
Oh.
And so there are regional variations, regional differences, and I would encourage you, if you're not sure if someone's coming into your work and what are they saying, clarify with my stuff. What are you actually referencing? Don't make assumptions. Oh, okay. So here we have another poll. I'm going to pull this one up. How is the poll is showing? Is it showing for? No, I have to move it. Okay, hold on. I have to move it. Okay. So the half-life of methamphetamine is 2 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, or you're not sure, or what do we mean when we say half-life? And looking at these results so far, looks like 12 hours is taking the lead. So we're kind of all over the place on this one. Okay. All right. So from my understanding, from what I've read, from all the literature I've seen, it's typically we say 10 to 12 hours is the half-life. So what am I referring to when we say half-life? Okay. Half-life really refers to how long it takes a drug to be excreted out of your body and metabolized. Okay? So the longer the half-life, the longer that drug stays in and has effects on the body. Can you think of a drug that has a short half-life?
Crack. Yes.
Yeah. Cocaine.
Cocaine in general.
And, yeah. So how do you see, when people are smoking crack versus smoking meth, what are the different patterns of use there?
Okay, so for crack, you're going to smoke more in a shorter period of time, just to maintain the high.
Right.
Yeah, just to maintain that high. Right. But I think that's one of the issues with meth, because it has a longer half-life. A lot of people might feel that they're actually coming down and then redo the drug or take another hit, and that's when you get overdoses and things like that. And that's something I guess we're going to touch later. But yeah. But I think that's part of the issue with meth, because a lot of people don't actually understand how the drug works.
Yeah. So I think it's important to understand some of the chemistry behind drugs, because it helps you understand these kinds of effects. And one of the effects of meth is that it's going to last a long time. And if maybe you're using on a Friday, be prepared that you're going to be awake for a
You're
while.
going to stay up for at least a day.
And if you need to do something on Monday, maybe Friday's better to use than Saturday, right? But it also has implications in terms of, as Colin was touching on, is an overdose because you can build up and build up in the system. Okay.
I mean, that's one of the things I do. If I know I'm going to be doing something on Tuesday, I definitely am not going to do, meth on Monday afternoon because I need the recovery time. I really do. Yeah.
Okay. So meth, as we said, is a long half-life. It tends to take a long time to metabolize in the body. That is also something, I also hear this thing around, well, people are just going to use meth because over crack because it's cheap and it lasts long. And I think that is true for a lot of people, but it's also a generalization. There are some people that don't want to be high that long, and they actually might prefer crack because they know they can come down sooner off of it. So again, we've got to be very careful with generalizations.
Yeah, but I also think too that there's, that there's been a move towards meth over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
But I think that's mostly due to the quality of what is not available when it comes to cocaine.
Yeah.
So you want a bigger bang for your money, basically. What's up?
Especially from the dealers and suppliers' point of view, it's a lot cheaper and easier to get some chemicals and make methamphetamine locally here in Ontario than it is to ship cocaine powder all the way up from South America. But we know that these drugs have been in parts of Ontario for decades now. It may be newer in some regions or some areas, or there may be workers that are new to it and haven't seen it before, but it ebbs and flows too. And I know that 12, 15 years ago, I was working on methamphetamine social campaigns here, talking to gay men in Toronto. So it's not a new drug, and I think that's why we need to continue learning lessons, right? Yeah. Okay. The price varies across the province, but generally it is a cheaper drug than some in terms of what you're paying for how long it's going to last you, which does make it attractive to some people. And the quality is going to vary. So we've got some pictures, but quality varies in terms of what it looks like as well. Okay, so just before we get into this.
I mean, just to put in here, I mean, a gram can last me and friends for an entire weekend.
Right.
Yeah.
But a gram of
cocaine would maybe 12 hours.
Right.
Yeah, so there definitely is that factor as that. Yeah.
So we have another poll here. Okay, so we have a list of ingredients here, or maybe ingredients. So methamphetamine contains, what of these chemicals does it contain, if any or all? All right, so there's some nasty sounding stuff there, and I've seen a lot of campaigns that talk about how meth contains all of these things. Oh, here we go. This is how people are responding. I'm going to say, okay, let me hide this. I actually would argue that methamphetamine actually contains none of the above, but there's a huge but, okay? These are the chemicals we've listed there are just some of a whole handful of other chemicals that go into the processing and making of methamphetamine. When it comes to the end product, is methamphetamine, okay? It's a molecule of methamphetamine, and that's what it is. And pure quality methamphetamine is just literally that. Yeah. What we know, though, is that there's no quality assurance when it comes to the illicit drug supply, and there are different ways of producing methamphetamine, and sometimes some of the residual chemicals can get left in if the cooks and drug producers don't know what they're doing. So technically, good quality methamphetamine will not contain any of those, but there are often lots of impurities left behind. And here's just a picture, I think, here. So in terms of how they're producing it and what's left in production, you can see there are different colored powders here. Typically it's sold as powder. Maybe pressed into pills. Not as often these days, I don't think.
Usually,
Right?
no.
And ideally what you would be looking for is this. Yeah. Does that look better to you?
That looks great.
And you can see why it's getting the name. So this is actually crystal methamphetamine as opposed to just methamphetamine. Okay.
It almost looks like glass.
Yeah.
Glass
shards,
right? Yeah. That is what it really should look like. That being said, some producers or dealers will at times color their drugs just for the sake of this, just so you know, identification purposes. You got it. You know, everybody knows this from somewhere. And it's usually just food coloring. Yeah. To be honest. So, yeah.
If there are any fans of the TV show Breaking Bad, I could never get into that show, but I think they were making a blue color, right? So,
yeah. And so, again, it's just brown. Yeah. But it really should look exactly like what we picture it.
I mean, someone could bag up some salt, and you might not, if you didn't know that, you might not know the difference. So one way to check that, you can actually buy reagent-based testing kits online, and you can use those to test your product and determine whether it's amphetamine, methamphetamine, or just none of that. Okay.
I'm going to add that I suspect that after a number of years, you can actually do, I mean, it's not recommended, but you can actually do a simple taste test.
Yeah, if you have a lot of experience, you know what
it should taste like. Smell like. But again, that has to do with, how many years you've been doing it. Yeah.
So I'm going to skip this slide. You can look at this later or click that link really quickly right now. But this is just a blog post that someone talks about the difference between meth and crystal meth and differences between those. That line, can you check it?
The leader has unmuted your line.
Sorry, we're just trying to get rid of this. Someone's got a siren or a kid or...
The leader has muted your line. To unmute your line, press *6.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about what actually meth is, and let's talk about how people then would take it, okay? And I just want to acknowledge there's an organization called the Gay Men's Sexual Health Alliance. They do work with gay men around the province of Ontario, and they're developing a campaign specifically around party drugs and methamphetamine. And so a lot of this next section comes from content that they've been developing. So there are various different ways. As with any drug, most drugs can be taken in all these different ways. And these would be ways that people are typically taking methamphetamine, although these three up here, injecting, smoking, and hot rating, are typically the most common. They also tend to be the most problematic in terms of people developing some kind of dependence on methamphetamine. The methamphetamine is not physically addicting or depending in the same way that opioids are, but we know that people can develop more of a psychological dependency, maybe some physical cravings for the drug. And typically when we see people entering into drug treatment programs for their meth use, they nearly always report that they're smoking or injecting it as opposed to snorting or swallowing it. So that's interesting. There's some physiological reasons why that's true. And I'll go into a little more detail on each of these. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, though, just for the sake of time. It's also important to recognize that different methods cause the drug to kick in more quickly or impact the duration. So while if you swallowed methamphetamine, it's not going to kick in as much. You won't get that same rush. It'll take longer, but it'll last you longer in your body. So if you were looking to be up for a really long time, you might choose to swallow it versus injecting it, because injecting is going to wear off more quickly. But if you're looking more for that
immediate hit,
you would tend to smoke
or inject. Yeah. And again, I really want to emphasize that one of the critical issues is that once people are high, the half-life issue, which really can lead to overdose. Yeah. I mean, so if you really have to, people really have to know themselves and their drug. I think it's really important.
Another question, and this relates to half-life too, is how long drugs can be detected in the body. So if people are going to be having drug testing done, and I literally thought of this last night, realized we hadn't put this in here, so I grabbed a graphic I found on the internet. These numbers make sense to me, but typically within people's urine, 3 to 5 days, they'll be able to detect that you've used meth. Up to about 3 days within blood samples, 1 to 4 days in people's saliva, and hair samples up to 3 months later. So that's a common question we get, but it tends to leave the body relatively quickly in urine and blood. In terms of injecting meth, I'm not going to talk a lot about this because there's not a huge difference between injecting any other drugs. And what I'm going to do is reference some webinars that we had created around injection drug use. And you can click those, or I think in the download, in the resources box on the bottom right there, you can find a link to our webinars, pre-recorded webinars, and those go into all the different equipment required for injecting. And as I said, with meth, it's not significantly different than injecting any other drug. Some drugs you require an acid to break them down, so you add vitamin C to the liquid. You don't need to do that with meth. It dissolves in water. Yeah. You don't even necessarily have to heat it.
Nope, not at all. Yeah. In fact, heating it might be dangerous. Yeah. You might be wasting your drug there. Yeah, it's a spoon, basically. I have people who shake and bake.
So you might just pour some meth into a syringe with some water and shake it up. Yeah. Right. Okay.
The only recommendation I have is really try to ensure that people are using best practices.
Yeah, and those best practices are exactly what that webinar is about, so we'll let you do that on your own. Okay. Perfect. Smoking meth. So we talk about smoking meth, but technically what people are doing is they're actually vaporizing it. So I'll pull this up in a second. But people are actually heating a pipe where the methamphetamine dissolves into a liquid, and then you recrystallize it, and then you get the vapor. So you don't actually apply direct flame to the drug, which is different than with crack. Okay. So people will be using these bowl pipes. We'll look at these in a little more detail in a second. They may be using homemade pipes like in the middle there, or you get these really fancy pipes where they pull the smoke through water, which cools the water down, and some people prefer that. Okay. So people were using a lot of homemade pipes. Those can create cuts and burns to lips. So more recently, we've started distributing methamphetamine pipes across the province of Ontario. And these are better than homemade pipes because they're made from Pyrex glass, which resists heat and breaking easier. And they're different from the existing crack pipes that we hand out. So those are the two differences there. Do you want to just hold this up in front of your, you can switch to blow him up. So Colin's just going to show us in a little more detail. Oh, like that.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everybody.
So
there we go.
I want to show people how you would
take the okay, hold that up. Okay, so I have my drug, which as we've already explained, are in shards. And what I'll do is I try to do a tester with every drug. I always try that because I never know the efficacy, how potent it is, who I've gotten it from, that sort of thing. So just to make sure, I actually usually try as a tester. So I'll take a small amount of the drug, which I can't really begin, maybe a pinch. And what I'll do is I insert it at this end of the pipe. Yeah, sorry, everybody. I've got to get this right. Yeah, here we go. Okay. I'm just going to figure it out. So I insert it at this end of the pipe. I never put it in this end of the pipe because I'm like, to be honest, I'm not sure. Yeah, right there. That's better. That's better. That's better. All right. Perfect. All right. So I insert it at this end of the pipe and then it will slide into the pipe. Into the bowl. Okay. The lighter, to be honest with you, I always prefer a Bic. I know there's some people who use Zippos or whatever, and you've got people who use acetylene torches. I've always preferred a wick. I can better control the flame better. I never ever apply the heat directly to the bowl. It's always sort of just, there's always been a slight distance between the heat, the flame itself, and the bowl. Once the heat is applied, the drug will vaporize, as Nick said, and this will fill with smoke. If that happens, that is when I leave.
Okay, so just if you can show, I don't know if you guys can see, but there's a little hole on the top of the bowl there, right there, and that just allows air to flow in.
So there's a free flow of air as well as,
right?
And, you know, maybe once or twice I'll do that, and again, it's always reheating the bowl. I never heat the bowl, by the way, when I have the pipe in my lips. I always just take that separately. Just, just, you know, exactly. It's just a matter of just watching this to make sure. It also helps me to make sure that, I mean, I'm not really burning anything in the bottom of the pipe, because, I mean, there's nothing worse than that. Okay. And when that's finished, I mean, maybe 2 or 3 tokes, as people like say, and then I'll stop. Let the pipe cool, and that's basically the idea. Okay. Again, as I say, I cannot stress enough that people really, people who are using really need to do that tester before. I mean, for various reasons, you might just have come out of jail, for example. I mean, there could be so many reasons that affect how potent it is. So I think it's something that people need to do.
And so this is a crack pipe, and you can see the difference there. This is just a rubber mouthpiece. I mean, we would encourage people to add those meth pipes, but we know realistically people just don't add those on. But that's to create an extra protection for the lips in case you're getting heated. And with a crack pipe, so I would be smoking out of this end. I would be putting the drug into this end, and you can see these are these brass screens here where I put the crack in the end of it, and then I would heat it, and the flame is going to actually burn the drug, and these screens are here to stop the drug coming flying in. Whereas with a meth pipe, you don't need to put screens in because the drug is actually sitting here and you're vaporizing it. So we were getting some questions earlier on, and why we're going into a little more detail here is just to help people understand, because we had harm reduction workers asking, why don't you need screens for a meth pipe? Well, it's because you're using the pipes are actually used slightly differently. Okay, so
yes, for crack, you are actually heating the actual drug directly. For meth, you're not. Yeah. Okay. Hope that helps.
Again, and remember these pipes, it's important that people understand how to use this stuff properly, but it's also important if you have programs, these are really good tools for engaging. So while we know that people can get cuts and burns to their lips, and this is one of the primary reasons that we're handing these out is to try and stop HIV or Hep C transmission. These are also just a really good tool to engage people. So we knew that programs were, harm reduction programs were attracting people who inject drugs. They were attracting people who were smoking crack. But now we have a tool to actually bring in people that are smoking methamphetamine. Okay, that can present some unique challenges, though, in terms of sometimes some of the behaviors that we see, and we'll talk more about that next week. Okay.
I saw where Shannon just asked, how do I test the drug before using? Just a small amount. So, I mean, if you're used to using, let's say, a shower, I really wish I had a. Yeah, you just use a little amount. It's as simple as that. Yeah, yeah, basically.
Same is true of any drug.
Yeah.
You do what we call a test.
Test.
Okay.
Yeah.
I gotta move along.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. This is what's recommended in terms of putting a crystal meth kit together. So this isn't relevant to necessarily everyone on the call, but particularly people in harm reduction programs. That's what we would recommend. And then there's some optional things that you can put in there too. And if you want to learn more about the program, the OHRDP, who distribute all these supplies through the province, you can download that in the resources box. Okay. I'm going to move us along a bit more quickly here. That's a more detailed explanation of how you would smoke it. Okay, so we call right through that. Okay. There is another way of smoking it. If you don't have a pipe, you can actually put meth on tin foil, heat the tin foil, and then inhale the vapors. But you want to make sure that you're using tin foil from a harm reduction program and not kitchen tin foil, because that kitchen tin foil has chemicals on it that become toxic when heated. So some harm reduction programs do hand out foil as well.
To be honest with you, that process is basically a waste. You don't get half of the drug.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some people
like it.
They like it.
Yeah. It's a party thing. I find that a lot happening at parties.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, we need options for different people. So.
Yeah.
Okay. And then another way that we're starting to see people doing it is known as hot rating, where you would actually crush up a small amount of methamphetamine into the size of a tiny little line, or what we call a bump. And instead of snorting that directly, you then heat up a pipe really hot, and then you would snort that bump through a hot pipe. And as the powder goes through the pipe, the hot pipe, it vaporizes. So some people are using that as, and people like that because it gives you that immediate kind of rush, but it may be a way of not, if you're constantly injecting and you need to take a break and give your veins a break, this is an alternative way of still getting that kind of immediate rush, but giving your veins a break. So you may come across people using, talking about hot railing. Okay? There's another way, people sometimes take drugs as a suppository. Doctors prescribe drugs this way all the time. It's an effective way of getting drugs into the body. So the Peterborough AIDS Resource Network, PARN, created a guide on how to do that more safely. So people may be booty bumping or plugging, which is also in the vaginal cavities. There are risks with this method, but it's also another effective way of getting the drugs into the body. But that guide is in the resources there, so I encourage you to download that because you need to know what you're doing when it comes to that. Snorting, I'll just say people really rarely snort meth because it just burns. It's not, have you ever tried snorting?
Oh, yeah. No,
recommend it.
Not recommend. Yeah. And you know the squeeze and up. Yeah. Not good. And then after time, and I've seen it, people do get blood issues within their nose because of the burn. So yeah, that's not something I recommend. Yeah.
You can also then swallow drugs, so it tastes really bitter. So people might just wrap it in a piece of paper, maybe a zigzag paper, maybe a bit of Kleenex, and just swallow it. That's known as parachuting. You can also just simply mix it into a drink and drink it.
Again, not one of my favorites.
Okay, let's look a little bit. So now you've actually got your drug, you've taken the drug. Let's see just quickly what's happening inside the body and what kind of effect it's having. And I think it helps to understand a little bit of brain chemistry. We often hear about serotonin and dopamine in the brain. Those have to do with things like mood, memory, reward system, pleasure. And methamphetamine impacts these significantly, these systems. Most drugs, recreational or psychoactive drugs, have effects on these systems, but we'll see in a minute that meth really ramps up these systems. Okay? This is a graph. It's a very sort of technical, geeky thing here, but this is when they fed rats. And they measured the amount of dopamine in the rat brain, and you'll see that there's a little spike in the dopamine that shows up in the brain. So they had a rat that was hungry, they fed it, and they see a spike in dopamine release in the brain. You also see the same thing. This is a complicated graph, but again, it shows you what happened when these rats had sex. And what this is showing us is that dopamine is involved in pleasure and reward systems. Okay? And this is what's happening at a very microscopic level in the brain, is that you have these neurotransmitters that are floating around. You add some methamphetamine in there. In the bottom right image, you'll see this sort of a wave of these neurotransmitters having impacts in the brain. And it releases lots of these neurotransmitters. It gets a lot more complicated, but trying to keep it simple here. And we see all drugs, when we take them and we get that feeling of pleasure, we see this spike in dopamine. But if you look at the scale of cocaine and alcohol, the numbers there are significantly lower than with methamphetamine. So when people take cocaine, for example, we see about a 400% more release of dopamine, whereas with methamphetamine, it's 1,600% more dopamine. So methamphetamine just causes this extra rush compared to other drugs. Okay. This also has implications in terms of, how you're feeling, but also the come down later on. So
Okay, so coming down from meth is hard.
we may be getting ahead of ourselves, but
yeah. I just want to put it that way. Yeah, it's harsh. Yeah,
it's harsh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these are some of the effects. We're going to look at physiological, psychological, and sort of behavioral stuff. Okay. Remember, though, this is so important to remember this concept that it's so individual. So it depends on what drug or drugs you're using. It depends on what's different. So if I was using meth and Colin was using meth, we're going to have different experiences.
Yeah.
You have different
weight, height, size,
reasons
of using, how I'm feeling.
Yeah. For someone who's housed, they have a safe space in which to use. So even though they're using the same drug as someone who's on the street, perhaps, the risk factors and risk profile is going to be different because of the unique situation and the context and setting in which it's happening. So
the other factors, when was the last time someone used?
When was the last time you used? What are the medications?
Drugs are you on? Right.
So remember, keep these effects, keep this in mind when we talk about the effects because they vary across people and time as well. Okay. Okay. Let me just pull up another poll here. Hopefully, you guys are all still following along on the phone here, and let's see how many of you are actually going to participate in this poll. I'm just pulling this up here, and I'm trying to make this bigger. Okay, so methamphetamine, we have mentioned it's a stimulant drug. Okay, so that might give you some sense here. Okay. All right, so the statement is methamphetamine can cause irreversible heart damage. Right, and we've got about 30, 40 people, so yeah, we got some participation happening. So, okay, let's see what we say here. And it can, for sure, with heavy, heavy is a very subjective word.
Yes.
Right, but for people who use more consistently, regularly, on a long time.
Yeah.
And part of the reason why, remember, it's a stimulant drug, so it's going to get your heart rate up. And as your heart beats like this, right, the muscles get used. And those muscles can become bigger. And as those muscles become bigger, they take up space within the heart. And now they become the valves and the chambers within the heart get smaller. It means that there's less blood to push through. And the heart has to work even harder. So over time, we can see this effect on the heart, and again, for people that have been using on a long basis and heavier amounts or larger amounts, we can see significant impacts on the heart, particularly later in life. Okay. So when we think of meth and people using it, the best way I think of it is that we often talk about the fight and flight response. So you see increases in heart rate, blood pressure. This is what your body's doing when it's getting ready to fight or to run away. We'll see increases in body temperature. So do you get
body temperature, sweating,
sweaty,
hot,
yeah,
hot.
So a risk there. Coming back to drug setting.
Yeah.
What setting are people using this in? And back in the nightclub
setting. Exactly. Or about health. You're going to get hot. You're going to get sweaty. Dehydrated, especially dehydrated.
Yeah.
And it's so critical that people drink liquids, water. I mean, I can't emphasize that enough. And again, it also depends on what you're doing at the club. I mean, if you're dancing as well, so you add that to the fact that your body's already hot, and you're sweating on top of it, so you're also losing the salts.
Now, many of the folks we're working with aren't using this drug in a nightclub context. They may be on the street. So why is it attractive to people on the street? Well, if you look at these next effects, the alertness, the energy.
It keeps you awake. It gives you it gives the impression that you're more alert.
More alert.
Yeah.
You won't be able to sleep.
Right. So again, I mean, it depends on what people are doing. I mean, so somebody who might be panhandling or something like that, they want to stay awake.
You want to be able to look after yourself. The other thing it does is suppress people's appetite. And if you're hungry all day, taking meth can
it definitely keeps the appetite. So I mean, one of the things I find I have to do to ensure that I can take my medication is I go and get my comfort food.
Right.
So something like
that. So here we go again. You'll see that suppression of appetite, saliva often dries up. We often see with a fight and flight response that people's pupils enlarge, and that allows more light in when you're getting ready to fight something. So you'll see very often with people using meth that they may have very enlarged pupils while under the influence. Sometimes it raises body temperature, but sometimes your hands and feet might feel cold because the blood is actually being brought into the core, and this is a defensive mechanism when you're fighting and you get cut.
I've also found numbness.
Yep.
Numbness.
You get less blood flow.
What else about?
And then this is the next one, erectile difficulty.
That's a major. Definitely. And so you take more drugs because you think it's supposed to work. And again, there's a myth. Well, I don't want to use the term myth, but there's the identification of it with a lot of sex, especially in some communities. Yeah. So I mean, you feel frustrated, so you go and do more, and then when you finally do get erection, it lasts you 500 hours and you get tired of the damn thing.
We'll also see people mixing erectile drugs like Viagra. So that can cause extra strains on the body, so we want to be mindful of those conversations.
Giving a word for it, fapping.
So
fapping. You do the drug and you jerk off for hours and hours, and that's called fapping. So there you go. You learned something.
No holds barred on this webinar. But I think this is just pause for a sec because we want to keep this real. We want to.
I think it's something, a conversation that people will actually know.
Having and some workers get uncomfortable with these conversations. But we want to challenge you around that because if we're going to have effective relationships with our folks, we need to be able to talk in ways that they understand. Not sugarcoat.
Yeah. So this is a term that might come up. Now you sort of understand what it means.
Yeah. Again, remember this is Colin has a particular connection to this drug and a way he's using. So again, next week we're going to have Brian in who will talk in a different perspective. Okay, and so this is not this is one particular perspective.
This is not the whole story.
Part of the series was to show that spectrum of use, because then it allows us to compare and contrast, like, why is it that Colin has been able to not struggle with meth in the way that other people are? What can we learn about his reasons for using and him that's maybe different from someone else?
Yeah.
What was the term used?
Fapping.
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 I've never heard that, so I've learned something. Okay.
Isn't that great?
In terms of overdose, there's a booklet here. You can click that link or download it in the resources section. But if you think about the physiological responses from methamphetamine, the concerns with overdose are going to be basically that you're overheating and overstimulating your heart and can potentially have a stroke or heart attack. So in those situations, and again, we'll talk more later, and we'll talk next week in terms of what you do, but basically you're going to try and keep the person calm, not take any other drugs, and try to keep them cool and hydrated, and that's what you're really, those are the main sort of key points there. We'll go into more detail next week. In terms of sort of the psychological and behavioral effects, we've touched on some of these, but some people report being able to focus more. Others are going to be more scattered.
I find that I'll just watch television.
People can get very focused. Well, the folks next week we're going to have from St. Stephen's, one of the things that they've implemented there is a bike repair workshop, because there seems to be this fascination in people who use meth in terms of taking apart bikes.
I've seen that. Where people, pull apart people's television sets.
People get very
Yeah,
focused on that.
yeah.
And this is where I find that it's very interesting to come back and think about the chemical structure and how it relates to Adderall and Ritalin. Yeah, and actually,
increased inhibitions, I see that one mentioned.
And on that, I'll just say that may or may not be a good thing. Some people like to lower their inhibition to allow them to get out and socialize. So it may be a reason why someone chooses. Other people, they might throw, safer drug use practices or sex out the window, and that loss of inhibition may be a dangerous thing for them. So again,
the depression, the depression thing, it's an iffy thing. So, for example, I just went through a period of depression myself. So I did not do the drug during that period because I knew that coming down from it would be 10 times worse. So again, I think people have to be sort of aware of what mental state you're in. I mean, if you're, you don't do a stimulant like this if you're depressed because coming down is going to be really harsh. I think that's it. Yeah.
So these are some of the main risks, and I think sort of touched on each of these already. There is one in the middle there around missing medication doses or even appointments down below. So you end up going on and people will, how long, what's the longest you've ever
I think the longest I've been up on is about 5 days. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that was years ago. I wouldn't really think about doing something like that now. But I think one of the things, you also, you lose track of time.
Yes.
There's that sort of issue. So you don't know, and somebody will turn to you and go, oh my God, it's Tuesday, and you're like, I was thinking it's Friday. So there is a loss of time.
And during that time, you may not be thinking about eating, hydrating,
appointments,
or taking your medication.
Even taking a shower. Yeah. I mean, just little things like that go out the door.
What are some strategies? If someone's having to take medications, what would be some strategies you might give?
If you have like a cell phone, make it beep.
Yeah, so put a
reminder in. Or
take medication with you.
Take medication. Definitely take medications with you. And I mean, if you know you're going to a friend and you suspect you might be there for a day, pack for 2 days, pack for 3 days, just on the off chance that it ends up being a little bit longer. I have a friend you can phone. I have somebody who can phone you and check in. I just to remind you, take your medication. If you're in a place where you have your own area, keep your medication sort of calm in a little capsule.
I mentioned them earlier, the Gay Men's Sexual Health Alliance. They have actually set up a text-based reminder system. You can sign up to this system and it sends you a little text to remind you to take your meds. Sorry, I don't have that link, but we can send that out afterwards. So.
The other thing is, if you're used to taking medication, food or something like that, try to keep that rhythm. I find that's one of the things. Yeah, that's about the best I can cover.
So what we sometimes see in folks, there are some people that will use a bit of meth, maybe smoke a bit, inject, and they use for a few hours, that's done. Other people we see that they develop they start sort of what we say binging on the drug, and they can be up to days at a time, and then they get into what we call a phase called tweaking. Right? And people can become very scanted. They may not be able to formulate thoughts or sentences as easily, or they may just be all over the place. They may also start experiencing paranoia, delusions, and at some point, though, the body will crash. And then you enter this period of sometimes you can maybe hide away for days, severe depression, isolation, as you sort of try to recover.
Guilt.
Like guilt, there's a lot of guilt.
Because why did I do work, or maybe just your appointments, just little things like that. I mean, adds up. Yeah.
And there's also a lot of shame and stigma from drug use, and I think there's more shame and stigma around methamphetamine use and others, so people may internalize some of that, and this can be a very challenging time for people to get through. We will reference a resource that talks about tips on this later on, so we'll come back to that, and next week we'll have more tips on this piece. But we'll see. And then people may start feeling better and think, oh, I can use again, and then they get into this repeated pattern of binging and crashing, and just think about the strain that that's putting on the body long term.
I think I want to add here, though, that one of the misconceptions, I use the word, is that a lot of people use meth and they use it and go to work. I mean, I think it's also important to understand that I mean, there are people who are functional users. So yeah, I just wanted to get that.
I'm going to move us along a little more quickly because I'm noticing the time, and I want to make sure that we get some questions and discussion. So bear with me here. That's just talking a little bit more what you see in terms of the tweaking. And next week, we're going to talk a lot more about how you would actually engage or support people that are experiencing this phase. Okay. In terms of the crash, you said it can feel really hard to calm down. So here's some things, in terms of things to do in terms of managing the crash.
The one would let your friends, family, or anybody know. I think that's really important, and that have somebody know what you're doing.
So I mean, and that's going to depend. Do you have a social?
Do you have a social?
Do that, but if you do, that would be great.
That would be great.
But as work is in the field, maybe that's a way of supporting people that we know who've been using that they're going to crash hard. Can we check in them?
Can we check in?
Bring them something to eat, that kind of stuff.
Or call them. If you can, if they have a phone, give them a call just to see what happens.
I think it's really important to also remind people that what you have done, what you've gone through is not that you're necessarily, I don't like to use this word, but crazy. This is something you have ramped up all those neurotransmitters in your brain. You are going to crash. And you have to remember that it will take time, but you will come back out. So just reminding people that, yes, you might feel like hell right now, but give it time. Make sure you eat, make sure you sleep, keep hydrated, and you will come back out. Okay, but it can take a couple of days, and even longer for some. These are some things to avoid during that period in terms of making sort of big life decisions. Remember, your perspective on things has changed quite a bit here, so be careful in terms of decision making and
sending text and email. Definitely don't.
Okay. In terms of longer term risks, if we think about the neurotransmitters that we've been playing with in the brain, and we keep using those up and not taking breaks, we can see depression set in. Some people may get underlying mental health triggered, so psychosis may come in, strains, as we've said, on the body. A very common thing, and I've never really understood the reason for this, is you see a lot of people, they feel like there's stuff crawling under their skin. They'll do the picking. So we'll see some of that.
And I think that I personally think it's caused from the heat release, but I don't know. I can't give you any facts.
Our body's just reacting to the chemical.
And again, it also depends on the purity of the meth. So it depends on what it's mixed with. Some are mixed with laxatives, etc., etc. So there will, I mean, unless your dealer is really, really good, I mean, you're taking a chance.
We often hear a lot about meth mouth. That's a big one. The media loves to talk about meth mouth. We see campaigns around that. Again, I think this is over-exaggerated. It has less to do with the methamphetamine use itself, but just poor oral hygiene. So if people are not maintaining brushing their teeth, keeping it hydrated while they're using, you can see this, but I think it's been over-exaggerated. So
seeing a dentist, I mean, I think these are important things for anybody who's using any drug, actually.
Any drug, yes. So in terms of how we manage some of the risks, again, I'll just go through this quickly, but these are typical standard sort of risk reduction strategies in terms of planning ahead, limiting what you buy if you can, thinking about what method, route of administration you're using, and what are the pros and cons of those, maybe giving your veins a break, avoiding sharing any sort of drug-using equipment, and avoiding particularly other stimulant drugs because you can just over-ramp the body. Try to eat things when you're high. You're not going to...
That's not easy. So, I mean, keep soups, I mean, your favorite foods.
Ensure.
Boost. I use a Jamaican equivalent called Nutriment, which I think tastes amazing. Malted drinks. I mean, anything that has energy.
Fruits and bananas.
Something that's easy to digest. And, you can just go grab it. Because, I mean, I definitely find that I really don't like to eat that.
It's important that your body is still nourished, so you got to do that. And then keep hydrated, so you want to avoid drugs or drinks that are going to dehydrate you more. So avoid caffeine and alcohol, really water, Gatorade, those things are good. And one way to check how hydrated you are is by looking at the color of your pee. and that's a very good technique for anyone. It's how hydrated are you, and do you need a bit more fluid or a bit less? Okay. Let's skip ahead here. Keep up with oral hygiene. We mentioned that. Lack of sleep and food is big, so accept that come down, accept that you're going to have to recover, spread the use out if you can.
Chewing gum is good.
Chewing gum's great.
Yes, it's really good. Yeah, and I mean, you get people who are what they call gnashing their teeth. Yeah, grinding their teeth. So yeah, chewing gum is amazing.
Something about stimulant drugs, they call it jaw grinding, crunching. Yeah. So again, throwing some gum in or having those in your harm reduction program, super engagement, and out those are great.
I've seen a lot of half injectable kits that include it. So it's really good.
Now we did say earlier people are unlikely to snort methamphetamine because of the burning, but people will. It's really important that if they are used to snorting drugs, and most often people are used to snorting cocaine, so they might pour out a line of cocaine and snort that.
Right.
Methamphetamine is so much more potent that it's very important that people do not take this line of methamphetamine. It would be much smaller amounts. If people are used to doing coke, you're not going to use that same kind of lines. That's an important educational piece there. We talked earlier about in terms of smoking less frequently than with other drugs. Following safer injection drug use practices.
One of the things I found is that, I mean, if you're with friends and everybody's doing a thing at the same time, sometimes it's really difficult to actually say, no, I don't want to do one right now. So I really think, you have to be thought of. You have to really know yourself. And I think for that, people learn to stress and say, no, I just did one. So that's other thing. But again.
There are some interactions with drugs. So there's some there's a slide here that talks about risky drug combinations. Again, it's similar to other drugs. It's not mixing too many stimulants together, not mixing too many stimulants and depressants together. And particularly with these drugs, you want to be mindful of other non-recreational drugs, so pharmaceuticals that you might be on, particularly things like antidepressants, which may have interactions. Okay. And I'm just, again, noticing the time, so I'm just going to move ahead a little bit here. There is a slide. So I'm just pulling up a slide here. Meth and sex, and I just want to get to, okay. This is particularly useful for many of you if you're working with people where sex and methamphetamine have become intertwined. And this is maybe more so within the gay community if you're working with gay men in your programs. This is an excellent set of videos from David Stewart in the UK. I encourage you to go on there and look at some of his work around tips he has in terms of working with gay men around meth use. Those two things can become very intertwined, and if people want to stop using meth, they very often have to also stop having sex, and that can be very challenging. So there's some tips there. Just wanted to bring the sex and meth use, finish up on that. In terms of tolerance and withdrawal, people do develop a tolerance to methamphetamine because your body tries to create this natural homeostasis, and if you're constantly ramping things up, your brain adapts. And then if you stop using the drugs, you can be left with this feeling of it. Some people it's just sort of feeling the blue. Other people it's severe depression. And you may also need to start taking more of the drug to create those normal feelings or good feelings. So people also will experience some withdrawal symptoms,
irritability, you're tired, you don't want to talk to everybody, right? You just want to be by yourself.
Yeah, but these are not, you don't get the same kind of physical sickness that you would with opioid drugs, okay? I'm going to quickly go, I'm going to just go over these for the sake of time. In terms of early recovery then, and we're going to touch on this more next week, so I'll skip it for the sake of this webinar. But it can be a very challenging time because you have made some chemical changes in the brain. It can be very hard to have normal sort of feelings for the first few days, few weeks. You're not getting the typical sort of reward and pleasure that you would from normal things like having food or sex that we saw with the rats. And this can lead to periods of relapse. I use that word in quotes, but using again. So there is a really good resource here called Staying Off Crystal for a Day or Longer. Again, you can download this from the resources section or click it there to download it. What I really love about this resource was that it was developed by people who use meth, for people who use meth, and what it does is it takes the distinct stages that you go through in terms of the first few days, the first few weeks, the first few months, and what you can expect if you're trying to stay off meth, because there are very distinct phases that people go through. So I encourage you to look at that, and we'll touch more on this again next week in part 2.
And ACT actually has a couple of support programs addressing people who are on who want to quit.
Yeah, so there are here in Toronto.
That's in Toronto.
This is in Toronto.
Yeah,
we're starting to see meth-specific groups popping up. So outside of Ontario, there may be some programs starting where you may see things like Crystal Meth Anonymous groups popping up. With the internet, there's a way of connecting there as well. So there may be ways of trying to support people. But within sort of frontline agencies or drug treatment programs, we don't always see a lot of meth-specific stuff. But I think as we're seeing there's a lot of interest in these webinars, we might start seeing more programs. If you are aware of stuff, please put in the discussion box there. If you're aware of specific programs within your areas, it would be great to share those with each other.
Or see if you can start something. If you think you have the numbers.
So just before we open it up for some discussion, I wanted to go over a couple of other things and a couple more polls because why the interest right now? Why are so many people particularly interested in methamphetamine right now? Because this is not a new drug. As I said, I was seeing it in the range that's been around since the 50s and 60s. So what is it? There is the Canadian Alcohol and Drug Use Monitoring Survey. You can click the link there. And they show very few people actually coming up, showing methamphetamine use. This shows you different drugs here over the years, and methamphetamine is highlighted in the green bar at the bottom, and you'll see the numbers are so low that it doesn't even show up. So this is a survey of Canadian adults. So few people in the broader population use it. It doesn't even register on big surveys like this. We know, though, when you dig down into specific populations and communities, you see more use. Okay? But we haven't seen a big spike amongst the general population. We do have data looking at drug treatment programs in Ontario, so I'm going to ask you guys a question and see who else is actually paying attention still to the webinar. So how many of you are participating still here? But if we look at drug treatment programs, so things like residential treatment, detox programs, community withdrawal, do we think in the last 5 years that we've seen more people presenting and when they come in saying, my main concern is methamphetamine? So in the last 5 years, drug treatment programs in Ontario are getting more people presenting with meth as their primary presenting substance. We know people use polydrug use, but very often they might come and say, this is my main concern right now is around my meth use. Have we seen more people using? And we've got about a third of you saying yes. Okay, some folks not so sure. And the answer is actually yes. We have actually seen an increase. So this is looking since 2012, and I've highlighted methamphetamine use, and you can see back in 2012 we had about 2.86% of people presenting saying meth was a concern, and then it's grown steadily over the years up until 2016-17, where we now have about 8% of people coming in saying they're concerned. So we also see a similar trend with amphetamine. So remember that they use similar drugs. So we do seem to be, it does seem to be showing up in drug treatment programs more often, but take those numbers with a grain of salt because those numbers only reflect people that actually made it to treatments. There may be a lot of other people that may be struggling, may be looking for support, but because of geography, particularly in this province of Ontario, getting to programs is hard. If people aren't housed, is going to drug treatment a priority for them? For them, for mental health issues maybe, stigma when it comes to meth, people may not want to come in and talk openly and honestly about their meth use.
That's a big issue within the ACB community.
What's ACB?
African, Caribbean, and Black community.
Yeah.
Where the general idea is that we don't have an issue with it. There's not a drug problem.
There's an extra layer of
There's
stigma
stigma,
there.
which also leads to, and that sort of comes from, that could have a religious context in it as well, but a lot of people aren't admitting that these are issues that are developing within our community. So again, if that's part of the community you're dealing with, you might actually have to make an extra effort just to get, and really get the trust of the person you're speaking to. If you need help for that, there is Black Cap and Actual, two organizations in Toronto.
Yeah, and they're happy to work with.
Yeah. Okay.
And also the other thing is, because we're seeing a spike in people accessing treatment around meth, does that mean more people are using it? Not necessarily, because it could just be that people who've been using for a long time are now struggling and now showing up in drug treatment. So we don't have great data in Ontario to look at that, but we do have some other stuff we can look at in terms of trying to get some answers here. So I do have another poll here. Give me a second to pull this up. Okay. So there is a study run every 2 years in Ontario high schools, and they ask students in high school around their drug use. Do we think that in the last 5 years, methamphetamine use has gone up significantly amongst high school students? Let a couple more of you answer that one, and let's see how we're responding here. Okay, so we've got about a 50-50 split between yes and no, or I'm not sure. All right. So 46.8% of you are going to be disappointed in your answer. This is the trend. So here's where you can actually get the data, okay? Click the link there. That's the Ontario Student Drug Use and Health Survey. This is the trend. Since 1999 to 2017, we have seen a generally downward trend in the number of, this is grade 9 to 12 students reporting methamphetamine. And I think this is very interesting to think about because there's a lot more attention to methamphetamine, and I hear that, that people talk about this spike in use. At least within the population of high school students, that is absolutely not the case. Now, bear in mind that this is a survey that's administered in school, so it's only reflecting the kids that were there on the day to fill in the survey. So who are the people who are the high school students that are not filling in that survey? Maybe the ones that are out smoking methamphetamine. So it's not reflective of youth in general. Okay, but
the ones recovering from smoking methamphetamine.
Right. So we don't see a lot of high numbers of use. Back in the 90s when I was going to raves, maybe we saw more of it then. It does ebb and flow. So not trying to minimize this at all, but we haven't seen a spike in the way that many people think we have. Okay.
And I mean, there might also be, another factor might also be where the school is.
So you will definitely see regional variation. So this is for the entire province, and it does not say that there isn't a pocket somewhere where, or you as workers may see a spike. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And that actually is a good segue into the next piece. So we also have, within Ontario, we have a number of organizations that do HIV and hepatitis C work, HIV/AIDS work. And there's about 60 of these community-based programs across the province and nearly all parts of the province these days. And they use a reporting tool called OHRD. So they every 6 months, they're adding data into OHRD and looking at the trends. And for the first time in 2017, they talked about methamphetamine as a primary concern for clients accessing those services. So in the past, it's typically been sort of opioids, crack, and alcohol are the big ones. But for the first time, methamphetamine starts showing up. Now, this is more so not necessarily scientific data. This is more anecdotal reporting in terms of what they're seeing and clients are saying. But it's interesting to note that many of these frontline agencies have started seeing more attention to meth use. But as Colin was saying there, it varies across the province. I think it's also just really important just to note, after we ran these webinars, I thought, no, it's a conversation I was having recently with someone working in addiction treatment, and why it was so important for me to bring in someone like Colin who doesn't struggle in the same ways with meth, because I was talking to this addiction worker who recently said, when I was talking about people do use meth recreationally, and they said, well, I've never seen that. In my work, I've never seen that. Not true. I don't believe it. Okay. You're an addictions worker. People who use recreation are not going to struggle.
And I'm going to come to you. Exactly.
So I think it's important, again, in the work that we're doing to remember what our perspective, how are we located on this issue. It can shape what we think and what we, in terms of our understanding and how we may approach these things.
Yeah, and I really want to, get the point that there are people who use and get up and go to work, and they use harm reduction techniques. Yeah, basically, some of them.
And again, we're likely not going to see those folks in our work. Maybe they're coming in and picking up some supplies or something.
Yeah.
But
they're not going to be talking to you.
But again, what is it about those folks, and how can we take lessons from them in terms of applying it to people who are struggling some more? Deborah, I'm not sure where you're from. I see, using meth and porn concurrently. Yeah, there's the connections with sex, and also just that focus of doing something for a long time. You'll see that. Yeah. Okay. I just want to wrap up with a couple more things, and then we'll open it up for some further conversation. So just leave you with a couple other things to think about and some resources. So remember, the media portrayals are very often very sensational, and they often neglect the history. So I was thinking back to this and some work I was doing, which is now close to 15 years ago, where there was a Toronto Star article that said city braces for meth explosion. It never happened. There are spikes, ebbs and flows. It wasn't this explosion. We also see, the cover of Newsweek or the New York Times talking about how dangerous these drugs are, and that meth, as forest fire damage to your brain.
But I mean, even some of the shows on television. Yeah. I recently saw one, meth in a small town in USA. Yeah. I think that's what it was titled. And I mean, the show, very graphic picture of people shooting up and then just acting really crazy.
Yeah, I was on YouTube earlier. There's a YouTube channel that follows people around who are tweaking it. I think it's actually ethically and morally a horrible thing to do, to film people. Not trying to minimize, again, remember, not trying to minimize the serious impacts that methamphetamine can have, and we'll talk more about those in part 2. But we have to be mindful that what the general public, and even as workers, we're often influenced by what the media are saying to us, okay? And they don't tell the whole story. There are some myths out there in terms of, I mentioned this earlier, in terms of people will just use it because it's cheaper and longer lasting. That's true for a lot of people, not true for everyone.
One hit in your foot. Seriously?
If that was true, everyone who had ever tried it would be in serious trouble. Okay? A lot of people I know have tried methamphetamine and decided they didn't like it.
I mean, and that's the thing. I mean, so some people like it and some people don't. And again, I think it comes back to what are you using it for? What are your reasons? And once you've got that, then you can progress
where that comes. Yes. More addictive than heroin. I mean, alcohol is addictive. Nicotine's addictive. It really comes down to the individual person, and just trying to say some are more or less than others. Very often, though, it has more to do with the route of administration. So, for example, with cocaine, you see people struggle more when they smoke crack as opposed to use powder cocaine and snort it. So there. Lifetime addiction, again, this is simply not true. Lots of people recover, people who have struggled significantly, and we'll meet Brian next week, who is in a far better place now. And I think that is an important message to relate to folks and that are struggling, is that there are opportunities. If we can get in, engage with them in a non-judgmental way, have open and honest conversations, and get them the supports, people do get better. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're sober. It doesn't mean that they're in recovery and not using it. It could just mean that they're in a better place. Or if they want to stop using it, if they want to practice abstinence, we can support people to do that. But remembering it can be a long road to that recovery, and there are distinct phases that people go through. And again, we'll touch more on that next week. So I think we just need to keep it all relative. People have always struggled with meth, and we've always had meth-related concerns. This was some work that came out of the gay men's work that we did a few years ago. We often blame meth as being the problem, but actually meth isn't necessarily the problem, but it's the result of the problem. And what we were finding within the gay men's community, and again, that's not reflective of many of the folks we're working with, but we found that for them, the people that were struggling, it had more to do with issues of loneliness, socialization, self-esteem, body image. When you throw in HIV to the mix, and then the emotional toll,
depression,
stigma that comes along with that.
And just not wanting to interact.
Yeah. And some of the work we were trying to do back in the day then too was around not stigmatizing meth, because we felt if we stigmatize it, people would then say, well, as long as I'm not doing meth, then I'll be okay with these other drugs. And we know that other drugs, all drugs come with risks and benefits, and we just want to be mindful of not stigmatizing a drug, because if the more we stigmatize something, the harder it is for people to come in and access service and be open with us. Okay, it's always going to be around. We need to compare and contrast the different communities and subpopulations so we can learn to support each other. This idea of intergenerational knowledge has been around for a long time with lots of lessons learned. So if this is your first time learning about meth, it's not that it's a new thing, it's that it's been around forever, and we need to do a better job of educating each other around this and just countering some of these ongoing myths and misinformation. Here's an example. It's Halloween is coming up, and we often see these kinds of alerts going around. This is one that has shown up basically every year. This time I get this email about alerting about strawberry flavored meth. This is just not a thing. Colin mentioned that you may get colored meth, but that's handy. People aren't handing out methamphetamine candy. That's just not a thing. Okay. And here's a good resource for youth that thinking about using. It's focused. It's based here in Toronto, but it's very useful information for youth anywhere across the province. Very non-judgmental, very real and vetted information, written in a very friendly and accessible way. So I encourage you, if you're working with youth, to check out the TRIP project. You can click the link there. You can just put it in the chat. And then this is a website called Hi, my name is Tina. Particularly if you're working with gay men, there's a wealth of information on this website. And then these resources in Australia where they've been doing experiencing methamphetamine for a long time there. They've got some very good resources. Click this website now, Cracks in the Ice, and it'll take you to a wealth of information in terms of tools, evaluations, web tutorials. There's a ton of information there, anything much more in depth than what we're doing. This is our first foray into this, so I encourage you to go check out the Australian resources. Okay. And if you're really into sort of the literature stuff, this is a good review of the sort of it's from 2014, but looks at all the latest in terms of treatment, epidemiology, stuff like that. Okay. There's where to contact us. Before we go, we will link you to an evaluation, but I want to open it up. So were there questions that have been coming up as we go? So are there folks, if there are folks on the line right now, if you have any last sort of questions, comments, raise your hand with that icon at the top, or type them into the chat box there. And I'm going to, or you can also follow up with us after the fact. I'm going to just move us to, we do appreciate getting an evaluation, so please click this now. It'll take you to a quick, it's just 3 questions. So please let us know what would be better, how to improve it. So we have another 15 minutes here. And if people would like to just jump on the chat or again raise your hand, we'll get you on the phone and we can have a bit of a discussion to end things here. So there is a question. Does meth affect people with ADHD differently than folks without ADHD? That's an excellent question. I'm going to think the answer would probably likely be yes, because they have their brains are wired differently, so the way the drugs are going to work. And we actually think there is some theory out there that there, in amongst people that are attracted to using methamphetamine or struggling, that maybe many of them may have undiagnosed ADHD. And again, we think if we think of the drugs that we're prescribing people for those conditions,
Right.
they're basically chemically very similar, if not identical, to the recreational drugs. Yeah.
Thank you, Vicky.
Vicky's just thanking Colin for his input, and
Thank you, Vicky.
I'm
I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, and it's nice that you feel comfortable sharing those experiences, because there is this stigma around it, and it's important that we break down those stigmas and having those conversations.
And I really, as I mentioned, I really think it's important that, especially for the ACB community, the African Caribbean, that they see somebody who is using the substance and actually is out there. And I'm hoping that helps with conversations with people who are from the ACB.
So there was another comment. Yeah, so the diagnosed ADHD, do we see people who are diagnosed ADHD use meth more likely than those not diagnosed? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know that we actually have data around that. Although check that literature review that I referenced. There may be something in there around that.
If there is any data, one place that might have information is CAMH.
Yeah, we don't do a good job.
I don't take that stereo on that, but CAMH are maybe America.
Yeah,
we might be able to
States is a little more, or again, the Australian.
The Australian. Apart from that, I would have no answer for that.
Were there other, and you hadn't noticed other questions on the chat?
I think you answered most of it.
Okay, folks on the chat, anything else? Okay, here we go. Is there any form of substitute? Oh, great question. So this is around substitution therapy from meth. Okay. We will get to that a little bit more next week, so the question comes from, people may be more familiar, backing up for a second, people may be more familiar with opioid drugs such as heroin or fentanyl. And what we can do for folks that want to move away from using those drugs is prescribe them drugs like Suboxone or Methadone, which help manage the withdrawals and stabilize people. We're also experimenting with prescription heroin or Dilaudid. So those are drugs that sort of substitute, move people away from a potentially toxic illicit supply, and also manage sort of pharmaceutical known supply, and also manage the cravings and withdrawals. There are not really good equivalents when it comes to stimulant drugs, but we are starting to see some doctors experiment with giving people prescriptions such as Adderall or Dexedrine to substitute in for their meth use. So we are seeing some pilot projects happening around that, and the folks that we're going to have on the call next week will talk a little bit about that, because they have been working with a doctor with some of their clients around trying to stabilize people with a known pharmaceutical supply, but there's no sort of go-to. There's also medications that we can give people in terms of managing some of those withdrawal symptoms, but those are typically your standard things in terms of managing people's anxiety or nausea. We will have some of that in next week's presentation.
The only thing I could add to that is that, for the most part, within the community, gay community, we tend to use more group therapy as opposed to medication. Yeah. That's one of the things I found. So there is a number of, and I think I did mention this earlier, so there's a thing called SPUNK, for example, that's done out of ACT, and I forget the other one, there's another one like that, which is the AIDS Committee of Toronto. And they have these group programs where people discuss the use and they try to get management that way. But again, it's not using medications, it's more group therapy.
Yeah, so we're starting to see some of those programs being piloted.
A lot of them coming out of the States, especially, a lot of them. So that's all I can add for that. I hope that helps.
Just see some people still typing. Again, if it's easier just to get on the phone, raise your hand and you can click on the phone. Okay. Amphetamines would be ideal versus methamphetamines, as they mentioned. Yeah, exactly, Joel. So we're starting to see some of that. The other thing too is that we're trying to get people to transition to other stuff to manage their use. Rather than injecting it, we might give oral drugs. which can sort of still have that effect in the body and maybe help manage some of the feelings and cravings, but they also last longer in the body too, so that people aren't having to use them as often.
But again, it still comes back to that coming down thing in the end. So, you know. Yeah.
And then maybe people may need to speak to doctors or addiction workers, maybe get in, and maybe that some antidepressant drugs may help you get through that period. Again, some people like it, some don't. So there are ways of managing some of those come downs or the longer term depression perhaps. And again, we'll come and talk a little bit more about that next week. Well, given that we started late, I want to thank everyone on the call or on the webinar for your patience with us there. We really would love you to provide us a bit of feedback because we take that seriously. We try to provide updates to how we're doing our work. So let us know what worked, what didn't, what else you would like to see too. So please fill in that evaluation form. Many of you may be registered for Part 2 next week. And again, I want to stress that what we were talking about today was one particular perspective on this. It may not be, you may be seeing people, well, I know many of you will be seeing people that are really struggling. It can be really challenging for some folks. It can prevent challenges within agencies too in terms of the behaviors that we see with methamphetamine use. And I know particularly there are some First Nations communities up in Northern Ontario that are particularly struggling right now around this. And I don't want to minimize the impacts. So I hope that you haven't felt that we're trying to minimize the impacts of this, but what we wanted to do is to start by just showing an entire spectrum because it helps us again next week talk more in depth. A couple other questions here. When and how will you share the recording of this webinar? Thanks, Michelle. Next week we will be running Part 2. So we will likely wait until we've got that recording and then send them out both together. We sometimes have to just check that the recording actually worked and maybe play around with some fixing them up. But we will try to get those out within, let's say, the next 2 weeks. If for some reason you want to look at this sooner or have someone that's dying for this information, we can send you the recordings, the ones we did earlier this summer as a tie-over until these ones are ready. So just be in touch with us. And you can find us online. Next week's webinar is full. We can't open it up for more registrations because we're limited with the technology in terms of how many people can come on. But we are keeping a waiting list. So if you email Kim, Kim, can you just throw in your email? So Kim's just going to type her email in the box there. Just send a note to Kim saying you would like to get the recording. Or if space opens up, we can follow up with you then. The other thing is, you can also join as a team. So if it's full already, but you have a colleague that's participating, still gather around the computer and participate as a team there. Okay. Anything else for folks, or are we done? It is 10 to 5, so I know people are probably done for the day. So again, just want to big thanks to Colin here. Also a big thanks to Kim and Frank who have been working in the background here sort of with the tech stuff and keeping us on track. And thanks you folks for jumping on this webinar, taking an interest. Hope it's been helpful. Hope it's been useful. We will, I can upload the slides right now. If people want the slides immediately, I am going to upload those. I don't miss PDF. Can I upload the PowerPoint? Give me 2 minutes and I will have the slides ready for you. So we can end the phone line, we can end the webinar, but if you hang on, you'll find those resources in a second. I'm just going to get those ready.